18 False myths of history. Sometimes, they repeat something to us so much that we assume that it was so. However, many of these stories that we believe are really deformed, hoaxes or blatant lies. Dr. Guillotin invented the guillotine. This method of execution was used at least since the 12th century, although it is probably earlier. It is true that his name comes from that of the French surgeon who recommended its use to avoid the agony of those executed. Nor is it true that he ended up testing the recommendation, since he died of an illness, not guillotined. Caligula named his horse as consul. Incitatus was the favorite horse of Emperor Caligula, so much so that, according to Suetonius, he wanted to assign it to the consulate. From there he derived the idea that he had done it. However, there is no evidence that it came to do, and that is well known the names of those who came to consuls, as they served to name the years. Rather it seems that it was a joke of the emperor, highlighting the weakness that had the senators. Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia. Nicholas II abdicated his rights to the throne and those of his son Alexis on March 15, 1917. However, here did not end the Romanov dynasty, yet, as he was succeeded by his brother Michael II. This lasted so little in the charge that it is normal that it is not taken into account, since the next day he abdicated his rights in favor of the Duma, who should be the one who decided if he would be Tsar again. Something that, of course, never happened. Miguel was murdered on June 13, 1918, a month before Nicholas. Marco Polo introduced pasta in Europe. The Romans, 12 centuries before Marco Polo, already ate laganum, a kind of lasagna, and the Sicilians already had basiata, something similar to spaghetti long before the explorer was born. The myth comes from the Book of Wonders, which tells the travels of Marco Polo and in which reference is made to pasta. Napoleonic soldiers broke the nose of the Sphinx of Giza. For a long time it was said that the Napoleonic soldiers had dedicated themselves to aiming with their nose, but it is known that he lost it much earlier, since engravings are preserved without his previous nasal appendix. The origin of the legend probably comes from the Battle of the Pyramids that fought in the French and Mamluk zone. Marie Antoinette, if they do not have bread, let them eat cakes. The height of impudence can be summed up in a phrase that, however, was not uttered by the French queen. According to Stefan Zweig, who said it was one of the daughters of Louis XV, known as Maidens. Christians defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Clavijo. Although streets, institutes or squares bear the name of the Battle of Clavijo, in reality this was never produced, as historians pointed out in the 18th century. So if there was no battle, there was no apparition of the Apostle James, or his white horse. If we look for who benefited this myth, it is clear, to the Archbishopric of Santiago, which in gratitude to the intercession of the saint received the vow of Santiago, a tithe paid by the peasants between Galicia and La Rioja, and that included the spoils of war, and that it did not begin to be paid until the 12th century, 3 after the mythical battle. In the Middle Ages iron maidens and chastity belts were used. For centuries it was thought that the Middle Ages was a time of barbarism and darkness. And if there was no evidence, they invented, as in the case of iron maidens and chastity belts, invented much later, in the 19th century. In the case of the iron maidens, it was a misinterpretation of the layers of infamy, which were used but had no spikes. The chastity belt was actually a joke during that time that did not materialize until the 19th century, to include them in museums. Salieri was envious of Mozart. Although today we only remember Salieri for his rivalry with the great Mozart, things had to be very different at the time. Salieri was the successful one, with important positions and teacher of music of personalities like Princess Isabel or musicians like Beethoven or Schubert. The funny thing is that he was also the teacher of Mozart's own son. Even Salieri, as director of the Italian opera, frequently programmed Mozart. The myth came because of Mozart's accusation that Salieri had tried to boycott the premiere of Figaro's Marriage, although one hypothesis suggests that it was a rival poet of the opera librettist who instigated him to do so. Van Gogh cut off one ear. The first thing is that what Van Gogh lost was not the ear, but the lobe of his left ear. And the second thing is that it is not so clear that he was the author. It is supposed to have been cut during a dispute with his friend Paul Gauguin, but this version comes from the memoirs of Gauguin himself. However, later studies of the police report suggest that Gogh was responsible and that Van Gogh concealed the fact to protect him. Nero burned Rome. On the night of July 18, 64, a great fire broke out in Rome. The first image we have is that of the Emperor Nero, well, rather the actor Peter Ustinov, playing the lyre while it burns. However, there is no proof that he did it with his own hands or ordered the destruction of the city, since he was not even there. Moreover, as soon as he learned of the fire, he returned to Rome and opened his palaces to receive the victims. But part of the senators were against him and spread the hoax that he was responsible. Building a new palace, the Domisoria, in the space left by the fire did not help to deny it and that it did not reach our days. The Vikings wore horns in their helmets. How do we distinguish a Viking? For its helmet horns, right? Well, no, because they did not carry. Actually, the image we have of the Vikings is the product of the Swedish Romantic painter Gustav Malmström, who came up with the idea of horns and wings to give them a more fierce appearance. Wagner's opera The Twilight of the Gods finished popularizing this image. Edison invented the light bulb. The incandescent light bulb as we have known it is the work of Thomas Alva Edison, but it was not its inventor, but it was limited to perfecting it. Actually, the original idea was of the British chemist Joseph Wilson Swan. In its prototype, the filament burned because it failed to make the total vacuum, a problem that Edison solved, making it commercially viable. The Indians had the habit of cutting the hair of their enemies. Yes, they did, but the barbarity did not occur to them. It was the French mercenaries who began to do so, to have a test of the annihilated Indians that did not weigh and be able to collect their reward. In retaliation, the Indians copied this practice. Fernando de Magallanes was the first to go around the world. In fact, the first ship that managed to go around the world was directed by Juan Sebastian Elcano, who had been his second, and in which 17 more sailors traveled. Magallanes, who led the expedition, could not finish going around the world because he died in the Philippines, during a skirmish with the Indians. Cleopatra was beautiful. According to the currencies and busts with her image that have been conserved of the time, Cleopatra seemed little to Liz Taylor and rather it had to be of the pile. However, as Plutarch explained, it was her intelligence and her character that made her irresistible. Good for her. Napoleon was short. According to Napoleon's autopsy, he measured 1.68 centimeters. Considering that the average size of a Frenchman of 1.55, in reality Napoleon must be tall for his contemporaries. The myth comes because it was not used to measure the metric system decimal, but feet and inches, which were not equal in France and England, and the calculations were left to the English for low. If to this is added that Napoleon was always surrounded by his best men, who had to measure at least 1.73, a barbarity for the time, and who called him the little Corsican comma even if it was because he was young he started to win battles, the myth is already created. The first parliament was English. The English parliament dates from the 13th century, while there are at least two previous ones, the Icelandic and the Leonese. The Icelandic parliament was born in 930, although it focused more on providing justice, while the Cortes de Leon was held in 1188 and is the oldest documentary evidence of the European parliamentary system according to UNESCO.